Yup. Hello, everybody. How's it going? Welcome to Yoga Talks Podcast. My name's Jay Brown. Thank you for listening. It's my pleasure to be with you again on this late summer evening. How's everybody's late summer going? I say late summer because I once read that there are certain strains of thought that actually think of late summer as its own season, like summer, then late summer, then fall. And they talk about it as being a time when things really, slow down, kind of a dead time before things wind back up, And I do feel like that. I feel like I could feel here at the end of August, the latter part of August coming on, things have a bit of a slowdown feeling. But I'm still busy, And slow down in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, it's not that slow. I was walking today with my two daughters. I needed to get them out of the house, so we went for donuts. My wife just gets so mad at me. I was like, let's go get donuts. And the girls are like, yeah, donuts. She's like, Jay. I was like, babe, come on, summertime, let's go get some donuts. So we went to Dunkin' Donuts, which is even worse because there's kind of like a fancy-dancy donut place. But I don't know. They didn't really have the flavors we wanted when we went there. So I was like, let's go to Dunkin' Donuts. So we went to Dunkin' Donuts. We had a great time. But I was walking with my kids, and it was so loud just on the streets. Like the trucks and the construction that's happening everywhere. It felt like an assault. And I think there's other times in my life when I felt very comforted by the sort of buzz of the city and the rush and the pace. But I don't know. And to that point, I just want to say thank you to everybody who sent me emails about different places in the world that I might check out. I'm making a list. And we are going to be pursuing, some reconnaissance missions to sort of see what kind of places are out there and if we want to stay in Brooklyn or if we want to go somewhere else. We kind of set the discussion aside a little bit. You can only talk about a thing so much. And we do still have time here for sure either way. So thank you for everybody who sent those emails. Thank you for all the supportive things that have been coming in. Those of you who made some comments on iTunes and gave us a review and some stars. And those of you who made some donations. Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it. And today, I'm really happy to offer you this talk with Hareesh Wallis, also sometimes known as Christopher Wallis, and we do talk a little bit about that, his two names. I really think that this is perhaps one of the most, if not the most, educational of podcasts. I really took this as an opportunity for me to kind of check myself. I've written about yoga philosophy over the years some, but I'm not an academic. I'm sort of like a punk rock yoga philosophy student. I've done things on my own, and it's never been at like a university level or anything like that. So I had heard of Hareesh on Facebook. We just, we have mutual friends, and I would see some comments that he made, and we had like an exchange or two. And he's like this guy who translates Sanskrit. He's got all these crazy degrees from like Oxford and Berkeley and all these colleges in Sanskrit and philosophy. And so, I was a little bit intimidated to speak with him. But I decided that I would really use it as an opportunity to just ask a few questions about some really fundamental things that have shaped my understanding of practice, to see if I know what the fuck I'm talking about, forgive my language, but sometimes I just want to make sure. I think I know what I'm talking about, but it is based in my own experience and reading and coming from a place of internal authority, which some people would debate as legitimate. So in any case, I do think I managed to get to some really fundamental things with Hareesh. He was a very engaging guy. We did have some trouble getting together. You'll hear us talk about that some at the beginning, and we ended up doing this kind of late, not super late, but somewhat later at night than I usually do. But it didn't matter. And I think it's a really, again, engaging and informative talk. And I do hope to get him back on again, because I think I could pick his brain more. So we'll give that a listen. Before we do, just if you want to check out my stuff, the blog, the podcast, the videos, you can go to jbrownyoga.com to find that there. And also just to mention that, I think I mentioned this last time, but I want to mention again, I'm doing some traveling, and if you want to meet me in person, I'm going to be in Japan, in Tokyo at the end of the month, the 26th through the 5th. I'm going to be in Finland, October 5th through 10th. I'm going to be in Falls Church, Virginia, October 23rd. And I'm going to be in Somerville, Massachusetts, November 13th. All of that, again, can be found on jbrownyoga.com. So other than that, I think let's go ahead and just listen to the talk. And maybe there's a few things to say on the other side. I'll let you know what's going on going forward with who's coming on, because we've got some really cool guests. And just again, thanks everybody for listening. Let's go ahead and talk to Hareesh.
Hey, it's Hareesh, Christopher Wallis. So sorry for the confusion on my end. Totally my fault. I had something kind of major come up, but it's all perfectly resolved now.
You sure? Everything's okay?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Okay, good.
It's not too late for you? Are you in New York?
I am in New York, but I would have been up anyway, so it's not too late.
Okay.
Cool. All right, well,
do you go by Jay?
I do go by Jay. It's short for Jason. There's another Jason Brown who teaches yoga in New York, though. And that's
Okay.
always been the case since I lived here. So a long time ago, he started going by Jason Ray, and I just started going by Jay because everybody called me that.
Okay, cool.
And you like to be called Hareesh or Christopher?
It doesn't so much matter. I don't have a strong preference. I use Hareesh in, yogic contexts, and Christopher in mainstream American life, I guess.
I see, and you've felt a need to separate those out.
Well, not as such. I mean, I got the name Hareesh when I was young, when I was 7 years old or 8 years old, from Swami Muktananda. And, I always had that name whenever I would visit his ashram in India. And so it was since I grew up with it, it kind of, I sort of grew up with a sense of a quasi-secret inner spiritual identity, and then an outer, more public name or face or identity or something like that. I mean, I didn't think about it at the time, but there's still this residue. There's a residue of that in the sense that, when I'm in a yogic environment, I feel a little weird if someone calls me Christopher. And when I'm in just, mainstream America, the supermarket or whatever, and meeting someone not from the yoga world, I would feel weird if they would call me Hareesh,
Huh. Wow, that's wild. It makes me think, you said that you got that name when you were 7.
Yeah.
And I want to give a little shout out to the Chitheads podcast that you did with Jacob Kyle, because I listened to that and I enjoyed it. And you mentioned in that podcast that you had like a mystical vision or a mystical experience at age 7. Was that before or after you got the name?
Before.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah, that was just a spontaneous experience when I was 7, barely 7, and then I got a name, more than a year later.
Well, I kind of feel like I'd like to call you Hareesh, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right. I feel like this is a yoga context. I'd like it to be.
Great.
Cool. So, the other thing that I remember from that other podcast that stands out to me about you is that you also started your scholarship a little bit later in life. Like I finished college at 22, but you didn't start your scholarship until later than that.
Yeah, I finished my undergrad at 28.
Wow. See, and I really appreciated you said in that, it was like, in a way, it makes sense to me that you do that later in life. You're much more serious about that. I know it would be different if I did it now than I did it back then,
Exactly, yeah.
Well, the reason I raise those 2 points from that conversation is because I feel like you're really representative of this new breed of scholar practitioner. And the first thing that I had in mind, I wanted to ask you that I think you already maybe just answered was, do you think of yourself as like a practitioner first and a scholar second, or a scholar first and a practitioner second, or does it not really make a difference and it's all just a mix?
It's pretty much even. In fact, it's a good question, because I've found myself spontaneously saying both scholar practitioner and practitioner scholar.
Huh.
So I think they're sort of even in my mind, and they each have sort of incredible assets that actually support the other. I mean, a lot of people in America especially have the idea that, yoga is all about experience and it's not very intellectual, but in the original Indian tradition, there's such a strong intellectual component to yoga that expressed as philosophy and philosophical treatises and works based on mystical experience, works based on logical argument, works based on a mixture of the two, vigorous debates amongst yogis. Not all yogis were intellectuals by any means, but it was just such a important part of the tradition to seriously and carefully think through what these experiences mean and how yoga works. And so I feel like to be a practitioner scholar is very much to be in alignment with that original tradition. And certainly the majority of, yogis weren't fluent in Sanskrit, but there was always tremendous respect paid to the seminal works of yoga philosophy. Everybody knows the Yoga Sutra, obviously, but there's many, 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 many more, most of which are untranslated, and that's why the West doesn't know them, but which were well known in their own time in India. So to me, the intellectual inquiry into the philosophy actually produces revelations and realizations that inform and empower the practice. And the practice allows me to make sense of certain elements of the philosophy that I really feel I wouldn't understand otherwise. So that's how I see the relationship.
Well, I really appreciate that. I know for myself that once I got over just trying to accomplish asana, I knew that, in order to really feel things, I almost had to feed my intellect to some point. I was quite cynical about stuff. And so it was almost like I had to feed that part of myself so it would shut up and I could just feel things. So it makes sense that both of them would want to be there. But I've never had the kind of, and I've never had the kind of scholarship that you've had. But I want to talk a little bit about that a little bit later. My other thought right now, the question that comes to mind is that when you entered your scholarship, did you know that you wanted to study Tantra, or was that something that you came to after you were already in school?
Yeah, after I was in school, I was already familiar a little bit with this branch of Tantra called Kashmir Shaivism, which at the time I didn't even know was a branch of Tantra. And I was also familiar with the Bhakti movement, the devotional movement of medieval India, and kirtan traditions and poetry, devotional poetry, and some other aspects. And I was actually of two minds originally. What did I want to study? Devotional poetry and songs, or this Kashmir Shaivism philosophy, which I knew was more sophisticated than the former, but I didn't know how much more sophisticated. And then as an undergraduate, I did a course with Paul Muller, who himself is a scholar practitioner. And that course, called Hindu Tantric Yoga, totally blew me away and opened the door to what has proved to be an endlessly delightful rabbit hole of inquiry, where, you know, this tantric tradition, so unbelievably full with profound reflections on the human condition and innovative practices and awareness cultivation techniques, the majority of which have not made it down to the present day, at least as far as the general public is concerned. Mm-hmm. So even though the mainstream teachings of Tantra, such as, you know, everything is a manifestation of divine consciousness and we're all intimately interconnected, those, you know, kind of general teachings have made it into the mainstream of yoga. But all the kind of specificity of tantric philosophy and of tantric yoga, practices of the energy body and awareness cultivation techniques, the majority of those have not made it into the mainstream, partially because they're so subtle. So it's been it's been like being a detective combined with a treasure hunter combined with Indiana Jones, to be able to discover this stuff, not alone, of course, with the support of incredible colleagues and teachers in the field, some practitioners and some not.
Well, I first came across you from like a Facebook post that you had where you mentioned Abhinava Gupta.
Yeah.
And I only knew that name because I had taken this trip to India in 1998, and I had met this Swami there who I spent some time with. He had studied for a time at the Bihar school and then spent time with Osho, but really spent most of his time, I think, in a cave, and then came down during the raining season to teach. And he kind of turned things around for me personally. And when I was leaving him, I said, who should I look to? Who should I study? And he said, Gupta, Abhinava Gupta. And then when I got back to New York, it was like before the internet. I couldn't find anything on him. Yeah. Like I did, like he didn't even exist. I couldn't find anything about him. And I would like to talk to you about him today. But before we talked about Gupta, I want to first say that when I did get back to New York, I went to the bookstore. I remember this always. And I just wanted to see what yoga philosophy books were there. And, mostly it was just translations of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And there were several of them, and I didn't know which one to buy. So I bought several different translations. Right. And when I compared them, I was kind of shocked by how different they were. Yeah. And I was like, wow, it just seemed to me how much interpretation from the translator is involved. And I know that you're someone who translates Sanskrit, and I read a blog that you wrote where you specifically talked about how, I've always said a Sanskrit word can have many different English words that you put to it. And some people utilize that fact to mean that you can have whatever interpretations you want. And you were saying that you felt that, no, actually, there's a context in which these teachings happen, and there's a context in which these texts happen, and that's where the correct interpretation would be. And you used the word correct. It stood out to me. Mm-hmm. And I think the only sort of, just that before I turn it over to you, the only pushback I would have is that it does seem when you're going to define the context of something or a text, that is also open to interpretation. But I guess my question is how much of translating Sanskrit is like a science and how much of it is like an art?
It's a great question, and I think is one that yogis in general don't have very much education on. First of all, there's a wide range of possibilities for specificity versus ambiguity in any given human language. Some languages lend themselves to ambiguity and some to specificity. And linguists, and you can look up any linguistic research on the subject, characterize Sanskrit as one of the more specific languages, meaning to say that it's possible to eliminate nearly all ambiguity if the author wants to. Of course, if they want ambiguity, they can have it, and they can utilize double meanings or paronomasia, which is kind of layered meaning and purposeful ambiguity. But if they want to, they can have incredible specificity, more than English, I would say. And that's why when you read Indian philosophy in Sanskrit, it is clearer. It makes more sense. It's more specific. It's less ambiguous. It's less airy-fairy. It's actually incredibly precise oftentimes. And so that's why I say the translations that we received in this culture of the West in the 50s, 60s, 70s were not full translations, because they didn't convey this specificity and rigor and power of language that the Sanskrit has. They tended to be mystical and kind of ambiguous and poetic and often beautiful, but they suited the audience to which they were written, not the sources from which they were drawn. So yes, there is often a range of possible translations of a specific sentence or a specific paragraph in a Sanskrit work, but that range is much narrower than yogis often suppose. Because authors generally know what they mean to say when they set pen to paper, just as when any educated blogger sets fingers to keyboard, he knows what he means to say, whether or not he says it very well or not. In the same way, any Sanskrit author knows what he means to say, and the job of the reader is to ascertain what he means to say, and also, if he's interested in cultural studies, what's in the background, meaning to say what informs this author's thinking. But at any rate, that's why I say there is usually a correct translation. Sometimes we cannot be sure what the author intended. And authorial intent is a very important issue when you're presuming that the author in question was some kind of enlightened being, or at least had tremendous insight beyond the norm for a human being. So if you're presuming that, authorial intent does matter. And that's what we try to discern in this science of what's called philology. That is the interpretation of what texts mean and attempting to get as close as possible to the original author's thought. And that's what I'm passionately interested in, and I can't say I always get it right, but to cleave ever closer to the mind of Abhinava Gupta or his successor Kshemarajah is a thrilling exercise. It's like my version of skydiving or something, because these minds were absolutely luminous. I've never read anything like it in English, or very, very rarely. And just to like comprehend what they're trying to express in this beautifully ornate language of Sanskrit is really the most fulfilling thing I can imagine doing with my time.
Well, that certainly comes across in your writings. And another thing that I really appreciate about, because I spent some time on your site just recently getting ready to talk to you, was that it's always really clear where there's a translation and then it says my comment, like when it's commentary.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes that's the difference, is like the actual translations, even when they're translated, they still remain in a more poetic language. It's almost like reading Shakespearean sonnets or something to learn about love. Like you can totally do that, but it is going to require some explication,
Right.
And so it seems to me that to be clear about when it's like you're literally trying to make a translation and when you're adding your commentary on what you believe that's saying is sometimes where it gets murky. And I know you've kind of called people out on that some.
Exactly, and what's interesting is that the commentary, the translator's commentary, must be separated from the translation, And yet it's a part of the translation because the translator knows a heck of a lot more, if he actually can read Sanskrit and is familiar with the literature. He knows a heck of a lot more, or she knows a heck of a lot more, and there are some women Sanskritists these days, thank God, about the context of the work in question than the reader knows. So in order to ascertain what the author means to express, the translator often has to give a little bit of that context, which was obvious to the readers in the author's own time. And one of my professors taught me to ask the crucial question: what does this author believe is so obvious to his audience that he needn't bother say it? And that's something that readers today don't often ask themselves when they're reading a text from another era. They don't ask themselves, well, what context to this author was so obvious that he needn't bother say it, but by that very token is so important.
And there was certainly a context there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Because all of these incredible spiritual texts, they are what we call, as scholars, intertextual, meaning they pay homage to earlier revelations, if you will, and they allude to esoteric practices, and they see themselves as part of a complex body of work. They don't see themselves in isolation, and there's absolutely no vision in this culture at this time of the independent artist expressing his individual experience that seems so important to Americans. That whole ethic is just completely absent. It's of a collective enterprise of truth-seeking and meaning-making, and each author sees themselves as embedded in a web of interrelationships. So context is even more important than it is for reading American literature or poetry.
Well, now I want to talk a little bit about Abhinava Gupta, because when I met that Swami, the big switch, like the overall switch, was that I showed up with this very abstract idea in my head that if I followed these 8 steps, I could accomplish some consciousness that would make me beyond suffering or something like that. It wasn't fully formed. And he sort of flipped it around to this very different idea. He would say, oh, you need to do a little something, you do a little something. It was more about just being able to be in life and have joy in that. And, when I got back and I got those translations of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, I also did end up finding my way to an article by Georg Feuerstein, who is also, I guess, one of the earlier scholar practitioners.
Sure, yeah.
And it was called Archaic Yoga. And it was specifically about the yoga before Patanjali. And he was dating it back to like earlier Stone Age shamanism.
Yeah.
And he draws this really sharp distinction between what he saw happening, or what he took from the early Vedic hymns, and what Patanjali was talking about. He talks about the difference between people going inwards and having inspired inner vision of like some sort of cosmic order, and then manifesting that in their attitudes and actions, as opposed to like this liberation of this individual self, or this almost like extinction of what we would consider, I'm quoting, atypically human. And so that's become, to me, it seems like such a fundamental thing, which I've heard you talk about, is the difference between non-dualism and dualism. And I'm just wondering, like, I've also heard people translate Patanjali's Yoga Sutras in like a non-dual way. So my question is, do you think that Patanjali's Yoga Sutras are inherently dualistic, and then someone's putting a non-dual lens on top of that? Or can it be interpreted both ways?
Well, this is such an important question, and we have to look at it from 2 different angles: historical and spiritual. Historically, Sanskrit scholars have a total consensus. There's no dispute at all about the fact that Patanjali is explicitly and avowedly dualistic, and that Patanjali's yoga, in some sense, we could say, if we exaggerated a bit, is about escaping the human condition and Patanjali's word for liberation, spiritual liberation, is specifically kaivalya, which literally means isolation or separation. And he means separation from the ordinary human condition of suffering, separation from all attachments, separation from body identification, and ultimately separation from the body itself and the conditions of embodiment which cause suffering. So in that sense, it's what we call a transcendentalist philosophy or spiritual path. It seeks an up and out trajectory, to get free of this veil of tears, as it were. And that's abundantly clear in Patanjali and in the early commentaries on Patanjali. And the reason it's not clear to yogis today is because the influence of Tantra was so great that after about the year 1200, nobody wrote commentaries on Patanjali from a sympathetic point of view. And for the evidence of this, if you want, you can see David White's new book, The Biography of the Yoga Sutra, the story of the Yoga Sutra across time, which has a lot of good points to make. And he points out, nobody wrote a sympathetic commentary supporting Patanjali's view after about 12 or 1300. And that certainly includes our modern authors like Iyengar, who have essentially written a Tantra-influenced commentary and translate the sutras in accordance with that view, even if it means mistranslating them. And this actually started, in the modern period with Vivekananda over 100 years ago, who also gave a non-dualist spin to Patanjali. Now we can say this is certainly not what Patanjali meant, but then there's this other important question: is it not spiritually more efficacious? If the answer is yes, and I think it often is, depending on the translator, then you see it's true in a different sense. It's not true in the sense that it doesn't accord with Patanjali's intention, as is abundantly clear in the Sanskrit, but it's true in the sense that it offers an interpretation of this originally dualistic text that's actually, I think, more in line with the nature of reality and more beneficial to human beings, at least in our era, if not in others as well. So that nuances the question. You see, it's not a simple black and white of this translation's wrong or whatever.
I got that. Well, that makes a lot of sense to me, because in the schools, and I've studied, in Desikachar, Krishnamacharya tradition, they do translations or commentary on the sutras that are very non-dual and in sense. And I've often questioned them because I've kind of fancy myself more radical about my non-duality, and there's always some qualifications on it. And it seems like there would have to be some kind of qualifications on it if Patanjali is your source text.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
You can spin it towards the non-dual, but you never entirely get there. And that's the problem I have with Iyengar's translation, is it's this muddle in the middle. It's sort of non-dual and then it's sort of not. So you get these conservative Brahminical values of renunciation mixed in with non-dualistic tantric ideas of oneness, and the liberation of consciousness that implies, but they don't actually cohere effectively. You can't have at the same time conservative Brahminical values that emphasize hierarchy and tantric values that emphasize the beauty of self-expression in whatever way consciousness chooses to move through that individual. So in tantric values are more aligned with our values in modern culture of egalitarianism. Well, not everyone's values, right?
Yeah.
Values most yogis hold. Egalitarianism, freedom of expression, non-discrimination against people on the basis of class, sexual preference, and so on. All of that is a part of Tantra and not a part of conservative Brahminical values. And in all of these translations, not only Iyengar, but Sachidananda in the 60s and others, we see this mixture of these two actually incompatible, or at least partially incompatible systems. And by the way, just to mention briefly, I'm actually very soon going to start a project and I'm just mentioning it because it's relevant, of releasing videos where for each Yoga Sutra, I give the original meaning vis-a-vis Patanjali and his early commentators, and then give what a tantric reinterpretation of that sutra would be, but marked as separate, as distinct interpretations, so that we don't have this muddle,
Well, I appreciate that, but I also appreciate what you said in terms of like, it's not that one's true and one's not, because if someone utilizes that text in a certain way and makes it true for them in a certain way, we can't say that that's not true.
Well, exactly. And when I do these videos where I give classical and tantric interpretations of each sutra, I'm not going to say one's right or one's wrong. I'll leave it to the viewer to decide for themselves, because indeed, sometimes a classical approach can serve a person. For example, if you're a yogi seeking to become free of addiction, then classical yoga of renunciation might be of greater service than the tantric view that regards everything as an expression of the divine.
Well, that brings me to something. Before we talk about whether everything being an expression of divine and how that makes it hard for people who are in recovery, I first want to go back to something you said, because I think it's an important question to me personally, which is this idea of if Tantra is is it a self-determined thing, or is it like a more prescribed path? Because I know there's Tantric, there's lineage and there's texts, and then there's more general ideas of what Tantra teaches. And is it fair to say that as if it's a Tantra, that means that you determine it?
No, definitely not. Because the traditional view is that if you already knew how to free yourself of delusion and suffering, you would have done so. And therefore, you give yourself over to a lineage and to a compassionate and effective teacher, not to abdicate your authority, but to obtain guidance. And if the teacher is effective, he or she makes you increasingly independent of the teacher, meaning the effective teacher in this model is always trying to put themselves out of a job.
Right.
But the student does need a teacher at a critical phase, the early phases of the path, and then the teacher continuously empowers and educates the student until they are able to access their inner intuition, this intuitive faculty that the tradition calls pratibha, which is thought to be something much deeper than the mind. And it's difficult to talk about in words, intuitive faculty that is sometimes called the inner guru. So the tradition says the function of the outer guru, and guru just means teacher here, not lofty person to put on a pedestal, but the function of the outer guru is to lead you to the inner guru as quickly as possible, to make you not dependent on the teacher as quickly as possible.
See, I guess that's I think that's what I meant, that this inner guru that you're talking about, like that's what you'd be pointing a student to. But that from there, they take the reins. It's not like the teacher's prescribing the path that they're supposed to take.
Right. But, the ideal, and Americans, I think, balk at this, the ideal in the tradition is that the student's humble enough to say, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. I don't know how to be free of suffering. I've tortured myself. My mind's all full of these. Help me.
Yeah.
I'll do what you say, as Arjuna says in the Bhagavad Gita to Krishna. I will do your bidding, and that's where, of course, it matters that the teacher really has the student's interests at heart, not their own, and that's why the tradition says test your teacher for a year before you fully commit.
Oh, that's what it says. Test your teacher for a year before you commit.
Yes, critically look at, are the other students of this teacher, are they getting more and more independent and more self-confident, self-dependent, or are they transferring all their authority to the teacher? And such other critical reflections that you engage in, and if you feel good about the community and the teacher, and you commit. And then you trust And in that act of trust, there's a tremendous relief because you don't have to do it all your own. You have community, you have peers, you have a teacher who you find effective, and it may only be for a few years. That it's not like you're creating a new ego identity on the basis of this community. You're just taking the support of a powerful and effective guide until your everything clarifies to the extent that your mind is sufficiently quiet and your inner sense is sufficiently clear that you feel this deep inner pull that we call by the name pratibha in Sanskrit, that it's the kind of golden thread that leads you along your individual path. Because even though the path is universal, everyone's version of it is individual, and we don't all do the things in the same order or express it the same way. We all have individual versions of a universal path. So ultimately you have to follow your own golden thread that leads you from one insider realization to another.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.